Hey George, Chris Arledge here. Can we talk for a minute? Listen, I had something else planned for this whole Musings from Arledge thing this week, but then I read your statements and it occurred to me that I didn't really have any choice but to talk to you because, let's be honest, it seems to me there's some things you should hear, especially because the statement that I read in the paper was full of, manure. Look, here's what you said. You were talking about the Pac-12's new media rights deal. And listen, I understand. You're just trying to do your job. I know it's been a really busy 15 months for you as Pac-12 commissioner. The reality is that those pumps aren't going to man themselves, and somebody's got to make sure that all of the lifeboat seats are filled, and I guess that's you. But if you're going to go out and make public statements, those public statements should be based at least a little bit in reality. Here's what you said. You said the new Pac-12 media rights deal would, quote, close the gap between us and the Big Ten and the SEC. Eventually, we'll catch those guys. It will take a couple of steps, but we're going to take a step towards closing that gap. Then we're going to be looking at expansion. We're going to be looking at schools that make sense for us. Okay, George. So your plan is to expand the Pac-12, and by expanding the Pac-12, you are going to catch the Big Ten and the SEC when it comes to revenues. That's what you're telling us? Who exactly are those expansion candidates? Notre Dame? The Yankees? Manchester United? Who is it you can bring in that will help close that gap? See, here's the thing, George. Nobody believes that statement, including you. You know it's not true. There hasn't been a single analysis by anybody anywhere suggesting that if the Pac-12 goes out and picks up, San Diego State or Boise or any other programs that you could get, that somehow that will help close the gap between the Pac-12 and the rest of the college football world. Therefore, when I hear you say things like that, it makes me think that you're trying to trick somebody. I'm not sure exactly who that somebody is, but it's not me. It's not anybody else who knows anything about college football. So what are we doing here, George? Look, here's the reality. The Pac-12 is tanking financially, and it has been for some time. The other conferences, the big conferences, have so much more money. Nick Saban can go out and hire just about every coach that's coached at the Division I level as a head coach and been fired. He can pay all those guys and collect them in a room like monkeys at the typewriter doing quality control. That's what Nick Saban can do. And you want USC to compete against that? How? Getting a third of the revenues? A quarter of the revenues? The Pac-12 teams are headed towards being like the Cleveland Indians in Major League, where they have to get an outboard motor from a bass boat to get bubbles in the whirlpool, where they're riding on a plane where you have to duct tape the wings to the fuselage. That's where the Pac-12 is headed, and everybody knows that, including you. So why are you telling us this? How about this one? I have yet to talk to anyone in the UCLA and USC community who's in favor of the move to the Big Ten. Well, maybe you're talking to the wrong people, George. I don't know who it is you're talking to. Apparently you're talking to people in the USC community who hate USC football. Who is that? Some guy who just got fired off the maintenance staff? Pat Hayden? I have no idea who these people are that hate USC football so much that they think it's better to stay in the Pac-12. Because here's the thing. I think maybe you're asking the wrong question, George. You may be asking the question, did we want to have to leave the Big 12? We did not want to have to leave the Big 12. Nobody did. I didn't. Nobody else did. We didn't want to have to do that. It's just as between going to the Big Ten, where you're going to have the revenues that will allow you to compete with Oklahoma, Ohio State, Alabama, and the rest, and staying here with you, well, then the choice is pretty simple. And listen, I know that this is not all your fault. I know what you took over. You took over from the worst commissioner in college football history. A guy who had no idea what he was doing, who had only had experience running a sport that nobody watches, who was tasked with putting together a television network, something he was completely unequipped to do, and then he was left in place for 11 years. And it turns out that 11 years is more than enough time to completely destroy what used to be called the Conference of Champions. I get that that's not your fault. When the brain trust that runs this conference, the presidents and the athletic directors, including the former president of USC and a former athletic director of USC, when they made the decision to put Larry Scott in charge and leave him there for more than a decade, that was the equivalent of having a meeting where everybody's asked to bring a gallon of gasoline and then they just douse themselves in the room, light it on fire, and sit there for a decade and see what happens. What happens, of course, is you're left in the burning husk of what used to be something worthwhile. That's what they did, and I know that's not your fault, okay? But here's the thing. Just because you fell into the captain's seat after it already hit the iceberg doesn't change what we're looking at. If you want to compete in college football today, you have to have money. And if you're in the Pac-12, you're not going to have any. And you're not going to expand your way to that. We know that. Here's the other thing. And this is why USC fans like me are just a little bit offended by what you had to say. Because you act like there's something outrageous about running to the Big Ten. Like this is something terrible and that the whole USC community knows it's wrong. Actually, George, you know what we find a little bit offensive? You saw the report from the University of California that analyzed the impact of USC going to the Big Ten. And you saw, like I did, that in media rights alone, every conference team that remains will lose about $10 million per year because USC is leaving. Now let's do the math. $10 million a year times 10 teams left over. That means that there's $100 million that USC has been contributing to the rest of the Pac-12 conference. That's a pretty big check. Every single year, essentially, USC is taking a $10 million check and handing it to Arizona State. Here you go, Arizona State. Buy yourself something nice. Here you go, Wazoo. Maybe get some uniforms. Maybe get a new basketball coach. Here you go, Oregon State. Maybe you can refurbish a weight room. Here's your $10 million for this year. That's what USC has been doing for a long time. Now look, here's the thing about it. And I don't know if you know how philanthropy works, George, but in most cases, if you're writing a $100 million check every year to an institution, any institution, a university, a museum, whoever it is, if you're writing a $100 million check to them every single year, they're going to treat you well. They're going to bend over backwards to make sure you're happy. And if you write out that $100 million check some year and you hand it to the person in charge, and what they do instead is kick you in the shin, you're probably not going to be thrilled by that. You're probably not going to want to keep giving. You're probably going to consider changing your approach, right? But isn't that exactly what's been going on? I want you to think about this. When USC got hit by the NCAA for the whole Reggie Bush thing, do you remember how the conference responded to that? I mean, remember, it's not the question of whether Reggie Bush was getting money. Of course Bush's family got money. And I'm guessing a lot of other USC families got money. Okay? We know that. Here's the thing though. The NCAA violated their own procedures and doctored evidence so they could pin knowledge on a USC coaching staff member, so they could find the lack of institutional control, so they could impose draconian penalties that were ridiculous in light of what was alleged to have taken place and in light of what was taking place everywhere else in college football for, I don't know, the last half century. I have a question for you, George. How many other national championship winning teams do you think had one or more players that received impermissible benefits under NCAA rules? Speak up, George, I can't hear you. Did you say all of them? That's the right answer. Let me ask you another question. How many Heisman Trophy winners over the last 40 or 50 years do you think at some point received an impermissible benefit under NCAA rules? Did you say all of them? See, you're good at this, George. Now here's my question. If that's the case, did any member of the Pac-12 conference raise their hand and say, hold on a second, Those penalties are outrageous. And by the way, you guys didn't follow your own rules. Did a single team pipe up and say anything like that? No, not a single one of them did. USC got completely ripped off by the NCAA, and all of the guys that are receiving the $10 million checks every single year from USC wouldn't lift a finger to do anything about it. Those are the guys we're supposed to be loyal to? How about this, George? How often do the other major programs have to play those weekday road games? The ones that have cost USC some national titles over the years. You see Alabama playing a lot of those? How many of those weekday road games does Ohio State get scheduled? It doesn't happen. Happens to USC. I got another question for you. How many of those teams play on conference networks that almost nobody can see? How many of them? Does Alabama have a bunch of games on a network that almost nobody can watch? But this is something that USC is supposed to continue to tolerate? Because listen, you've been there 15 months and none of those problems have been solved. None of them. In fact, you've been there 15 months and we're still seeing the same gross incompetence every single Saturday. Do you watch the games, George? I watch the games. Did you realize that the Pac-12 officials continue to bungle everything that can be bungled on a weekly basis, and that Pac-12 football games are now a national joke? Do you know this? Because we all know this. Look, a lot of these calls go against USC, and yes, those two critical roughing the passer penalties cost USC the Utah game. They did. But they don't all go against USC. Sometimes it's just plain old-fashioned, shocking incompetence. Nobody knows when to start the clock. Nobody knows when to stop the clock. Nobody has any idea when you should run time off or when you shouldn't run time off. They don't have a clue. It almost makes me think, George, that you guys don't actually have officials that have been trained. It's almost like you get a group of guys together. You say, how many people do we have this week for Washington State? Oh, we only have 4? Well, does anybody have a cousin that doesn't have a job? Maybe we can add him. Maybe we can go down to the bus stop. Maybe we can draft a couple of people. Maybe one of those guys can figure out when to start the clock. That's what it looks like, George. And I'm just asking you, when you say that nobody in the USC community that you've talked to thinks USC should go to the Big Ten, have you asked a single one of them, hey, what do you think about Pac-12 officiating? What do you think about the fact that every week going in, you know that something completely inexplicable will happen that might change the outcome of the game? Have you asked anybody about that? Because I have an opinion on that, George. I think that's ridiculous. And you've been there 15 months and you have not fixed that problem. In fact, as best I can tell, you haven't fixed any of the problems in 15 months. That burning husk of a building that you took over 15 months ago, it still looks like that. It still looks just like that. Nothing's been fixed. And you want to complain and whine that USC doesn't want to continue to pay $100 million to a bunch of programs that look for every opportunity to poke us in the eye and stay in a conference where we play games that nobody can watch with officials that have no idea what they're doing and may very well cost us a game, and that we should continue doing that forever. That's your plan. And you think we should do that because there's some mystery team that you're going to add to the conference that will so increase the revenues that we're going to be making the kind of money that Ohio State and Alabama make, right? That's your plan, George? That's what you want us to believe? Here's the thing, George. And maybe I've gotten us off on the wrong foot here. Maybe I'm focused too much on the minutia. Maybe I shouldn't be down in the weeds like this. Let me ask you a different question. Why are you talking? Let's put aside the specific quotes this week that were shocking to me. Let's just put that aside. I've got a bigger question, a more fundamental question. Why are you talking? You have all these problems to solve. You've been there 15 months. They are not solved. We know going into the game this Saturday that the officials will do something outrageous that we wouldn't even see in a Pop Warner game. Every single fan knows going into this game that's going to happen. I assume you know that that's going to happen. You have not fixed the problem, yet you have time to go out and give talks? You have time to go out and give public statements? George, you don't have time to talk to anybody. You have a job to do, one that you're apparently not doing. So I've got an idea. Why don't you go do something productive? Or if you're not going to do something productive, just go away. Because to be honest with you, George, we've got one foot out the door already. And we know we're going to get screwed over and over again by the conference until we're fully out the door. We know that's going to happen. We're going to make our peace with it, but we're out of here. And when that happens, and you're left with the 10 dwarfs, including an Oregon program that doesn't even want to be in this conference and continues to say that they're the SEC of the West because they're begging for the real SEC to come and claim them. Just like Washington wants out. Everybody wants out. Nobody wants to be here with you. They all want to leave. There are only 2 teams that anybody was willing to take, and they're gone. So that's it, George. We're gone. In the meantime, however, can you just do me one favor? Don't go out there and pretend to speak on behalf of USC fans. You have no idea what we want or why. No idea. We'll speak for ourselves. Good night, George.